Church. How's everybody doing this morning? Isn't it good to be in the IMAX where you can kind of spread out again? We got some room for some folks. I mean, it's no recliner and heated seats, which I know we all miss on cold mornings like this morning, but...
Sorry, I was talking to people.
Talking to people like you're a pastor or something.
Happy New Year. Welcome. If you are new to Bright City Church, my name is Sharon. This is Ike. We are two pastors at Bright City Church. And if you are new, Bright City Church exists to help people take their next step towards Christ. So whatever you are bringing into this space, whether you are coming from being a grown up in the church, lifelong Christian, maybe you're coming in, haven't been in church for a while, maybe you wrestle with doubt, maybe you have pain from your past church, whatever it is, our question for you is, what is your next step towards Christ? And how can we partner with you in that journey? Now, for some of you, your next step might be simply to let us know that you are here. And there's a really easy way to do that. If you will scan that QR code, you can click on New Here, or you can fill out the card in your cup holder and give it to someone in the lobby in a black shirt. Also, if you are new, this is a really great Sunday to be here because once a month we do something called Pizza with the Pastor, where immediately after this service, we walk down to California Pizza Kitchen and just have lunch together. Ike and I will be there, and it's a great opportunity to hear about who we are, how our church got started. We can answer any questions that you have. It's also a great time to meet other new people. But if you would like to come, if you don't mind RSVPing at this link, just so we have enough pizza, but if you also just need to think about it and you just want to show up, that is totally fine as well.
And if you, maybe you've been to Pizza with the Pastors before, but if you've brought somebody that's new, you can come to Pizza with the Pastors too.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so just saying.
Just like we're incentivizing. So that's immediately after this service. Another way that you can participate in the life of our church is through giving. We talk about giving as an act of worship. It is how you tangibly demonstrate the priority of God in your life. And so if you're ready to take that step in the life of our church, you can scan that QR code, or you can go to brightcitychurch.com/give to set up automatic monthly giving. And then a final way that you can get involved at Bright City, and this is a great time, beginning of the calendar year to do it, is through serving. Pretty much every team at Bright City Church would love to have you, would fall over themselves to have you. We have needs in Kid City. We have, yes, we have needs on guest services, worship team. Or if you are someone who you love people like as a Christian, but you don't love interacting with people, and you don't want to have to talk to anyone, set up and tear down. That is your spot right there. So there's a lot of different ways you can get involved, but just scan the QR code and click serve. We have just a couple announcements. One is that January 10th is the deadline for signing up for premarital and newlywed counseling. I guess twice a year, Ike leads a group of newlyweds or premarital couples. Yeah. That's not a word. That's not a phrase.
It is now.
Through a book together. And to just want to brag on him a little bit, that Ike is, he cut me off last service and said that he's really good at being married, which he is. He is very good at being married, but he's also really a wonderful counselor. This is something I can't see who's over there that's constantly applauding us, but thanks, Jennifer.
Our hype over here.
Yeah. Ike loves counseling young couples. He's really passionate about it, but he's also just very gifted for it. And so if you are a newlywed or you're about to get married, be sure to sign up for that. And then next Sunday after the service, our high schoolers will be going to lunch together as well. So just keep an eye out for information about that in your email. Yeah. So I think that is all the announcements for this morning. But you may or may not know that this morning is Vision Sunday. And Vision Sunday is something that we do once a year, the first Sunday of the calendar year, to share with you where we sense God leading us going into the new year.
Yeah, and I think this year as we were preparing this and thinking through this, we've kind of felt like it should really be called Vision and Culture Sunday because, who we say or who we want to be and who we are is just as important as what we say we're going to do. And I think we have really seen that over the last couple of years, how important it is to not just talk about, hey, here's what we want to do this year, but who are we going to be in that process and how are we being formed into God's image in that process?
We were also greatly humbled after Vision Sunday 2020 when we, cast the vision 2020.
Yeah.
And then, 3 months later, all that was just thrown out the window. But this year, as we were talking about where we feel God leading us, the theme of this year, just praying over it together, the theme that emerged is kind of a weird one for a Vision Sunday, and that is the theme of waiting. And Ike is going to share with you in just a moment why we feel like this is a topic that we really want to prepare spiritually for. I want to share with you 4 brief stories from Scripture that have really been instructive for us and formative for us in other seasons of waiting, but have also shaped how we're thinking about waiting as a church going into 2023. So we're going to look at 4 brief stories. They're all in the Old Testament. And we're going to start out with the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis. We have talked about Abraham many times before, but if you're not familiar with Abraham, he is the father of Israel. And we first meet Abraham in Genesis 12, where God comes to him and he does not have any children. His wife is unable to have children, but this is what God says to Abraham in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. The Lord said to Abram, and that was his name before it was changed to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. And I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all people on earth will be blessed through you." And so this was a miraculous promise to say not only is your wife going to bear you children, but you are going to be the father of a great nation. And so God issues this promise to Abraham, but then we see that it's not as if things immediately start rolling. And that's exactly what happens immediately after. Instead, there's a prolonged season of waiting, and it is not until Genesis 21 that Abraham first bears his son Isaac with Sarah. The interim time between Genesis 12 and Genesis 21 is 30 years. Now, during that interim period, what does Abraham do? Well, he makes a lot of bad choices. Even though God has issued this promise and said that he has a plan for Abraham's life, Abraham is constantly living in fear. He is constantly resorting to these tactics of self-preservation, of hatching these schemes, involving his wife in these really shady things. But then as enough time goes by where this child is not born, Abraham and Sarah then think, well, maybe God needs our help. Maybe we need to speed up this process. And so Abraham has a child with a slave. Unsurprisingly, that causes catastrophic relational brokenness as well. And on the other side of it, God fulfills this promise, but because they were impatient, it created all this unnecessary brokenness in the meantime. So that's story number 1. Story number 2 is that of Joseph, and this is also in the book of Genesis. Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham, and very similarly to Abraham, he is given this vision of this future. But unlike Abraham, Joseph is pretty young when he receives this call, which comes in the form of dreams. He's only 17 years old. And I'm going to read this story of these dreams in Genesis 37, but just a little bit of background if you're unfamiliar with Joseph, is that he is one of 12 sons, and he is the favorite son, and so his brothers hate him. And so just keep that in mind as I read what happened when Joseph received these dreams. Genesis 37, verse 5. It says, "Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, 'Listen to this dream I had.'" And you can hear the naivete here. It's like, listen to this dream I had, you guys. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. So clearly, this is a young man who does not know how to read a room.
I can totally see Sadie saying this to Isaac and Cohen, though.
Guess what, you guys? But this does all come to pass. This dream occurs in Genesis 37, but then in Genesis 41, Joseph ascends in leadership and becomes second in command to Pharaoh. But like Abraham, there's also a pretty long gap in time between those points where it's about 13 years. We don't know exactly. It's about 13 years. And during that interim, also like Abraham, it is not a straight line from point A to point B. Instead, Joseph experiences setback after setback. He is sold, not surprisingly, into slavery by his brothers who hate him. He works his way out of that, but then he winds up back in prison, works his way out of that again. And the thing that distinguishes him from Abraham, even though they both have these twisty-turny paths to their calling, is that Joseph waited well. He faced everything with integrity, with a good work ethic. And so he didn't create all that unnecessary brokenness that Abraham did. So that's number 2. Number 3, we're going to skip ahead to 1 Samuel, which is where we spent the majority of last year. Those of you who have been around Bright City, you know we spent most of last year looking at 1 Samuel. And so we're not going to read this passage again because some of you are probably like triggered that I just said 1 Samuel because we were in it for like 9 months and you're like, please no. But if you remember in 1 Samuel 16, God rejects Saul as the king of Israel. And in chapter 16, the prophet Samuel finds David, who is a young teen. He is working as a shepherd, and he anoints him as the future king of Israel. However, David does not become king until another book of the Bible. He becomes king in 2 Samuel 5. And the gap of time between those 2 points is about 15 years. Now, how did he wait during that time? Well, as you might remember, he waited very, very well. Even though his path was also full of twists and turns and setbacks, Saul pursued him, persecuted him. David had multiple opportunities to seize power from Saul, to actually kill Saul. So he could have sped up this process. At no point did he choose to do so. Instead, he was above reproach and he waited on the Lord. So that is story number 3. And then the final story is a little bit different than the others. This comes to us in Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible, in the person of Moses. Moses very famously is called by God to go to Egypt where the Israelites are enslaved and to command Pharaoh to let God's people go. Now, Moses' life was really defined by waiting. He spent 40 years in the wilderness working as a shepherd after he murdered a man in Egypt. And at the end of that 40 years is when he encounters the burning bush, where God commands him to go to Pharaoh to set his people free. And as soon as Moses does all of this, and at the conclusion of these 10 plagues, where Pharaoh finally releases Israel in Genesis 12, they go into the wilderness and they begin to journey towards the promised land. But the time between Genesis 12 and when they reach the promised land, that is another 40 years. However, what's really fascinating, what a lot of people don't know, is that the amount of time it should have taken to get from Egypt to the promised land was 11 days. It was an 11-day journey that took them 40 years. And the majority of that time, about 38 years, they spent just camped out just outside the Promised Land. Now, the reason this journey took so long is because Moses and Israel waited on God so poorly. Moses was constantly getting angry at the people that God had called him to lead. And meanwhile, Israel, despite the fact that God had provided for them abundantly, miraculously, had sent them 10 plagues to rescue them out of Egypt. When they were in the wilderness, he's literally sending them bread from heaven, manna from heaven. They have everything they need, and they're constantly having this scarcity mindset of fearing, will we have enough tomorrow? Will we have enough tomorrow? Do we need to hoard this? Maybe we should go back to slavery. It was better there. And so because of that, they wander for 40 years. Now, there's a lot that these 4 stories have in common. Most prominently, they all waited a really long time. That the journey from point A to point B was not a straight one or a short one. But one of the things that you may have already noticed is that 2 of these stories of waiting were much longer than the other. That 2 of these stories also contained a lot more unnecessary brokenness than the other. And the reason that 2 of them were longer and more brokenness is that both Abraham and Moses saw the waiting as something to fix. And that is a lesson that has really been speaking to us in this season of our church.
Yeah, the season of waiting that we're talking about primarily is the season of waiting for a space to work out. That's been something that we've been looking for and on the hunt for, is a building of our own to meet in and gather in. And this is really a journey. The waiting in this journey is something that's characterized the life of Bright City since the beginning. We first approached the AMC in December of 2017 before anybody ever knew really that this was going to happen, and asked if we could meet here, and they said no. And from there, we started kind of a long journey of continually asking and trying to push forward. And we finally got the yes in August of 2018, about 8 weeks before we launched. And so this long period of waiting. And so we launched in 2018, and then in 2019, we started to push our space here. We were kind of a point where we were running out of room, and so we're starting to look for spaces. And lo and behold, around that time is when the Sears here went out of business. And so we made an incredibly attractive offer to Sears for the auto center here on the street. That included them donating $600,000 of the purchase price as a tax write-off. I mean, who wouldn't take that offer? And obviously they said no. And so around 2020, beginning of 2020, we were coming into the season of Lent, and we decided to spend that season praying and fasting about a space and what God wanted us to do and what to look for and all of that. And so a couple of weeks into that, COVID hit and kind of took care of that.
That was not the answer to prayer
that's
that
right.
we had wanted.
Exactly. And so the space thing was kind of a non-issue. But one of the things that did come out of that is the fact that we were meeting in a movie theater. We didn't have to pay rent the weeks that we weren't using it. Whereas if we had bought a building, we would be responsible for that mortgage payment every month regardless. And so it actually allowed us to set aside some funds. And then in 2021, we resumed that search for a space and really dove in hard, looking at all kinds of options and considering different things. Towards the end of 2021, we found a sublease space that we pursued, and really pursued that for probably about 6 months, looking into the zoning and all of the kind of things that go into that before deciding that the amount of money that we would have to put into that did not make sense for the amount of time we would be able to use it, which was essentially 24 to 28 months. And so decided that that wasn't good stewardship, pulled back from that, looked at one other space that ultimately the landlord said no to. And so that brought us kind of towards the end of 2022 and feeling like we have no good option in front of us and we're really running out of space. What are we going to do? We don't really want to do the overflow thing. We don't want to do multiple theaters in the same, theater. And so really kind of feeling trapped and starting to feel a little bit of that fishbowl effect of, are we only going to grow to the size of the tank we're in, And then kind of out of nowhere, we made one last plea to AMC and IMAX to say, hey, can we meet in the IMAX? And lo and behold, they said yes. And so it was just kind of this divine provision in this moment, exactly when we needed it. You know, it's kind of that saying of God is always on time, but rarely ahead of time. And so it was kind of God saying, hey, I haven't forgotten you. I haven't abandoned you. I haven't left you without an option. I'm still here. I'm still providing in all of the ways that I've always been. And so that's kind of where we're at this point in the journey.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about the IMAX, a lot of you may not know that the IMAX is owned separately. It's not a part of AMC. And so the permission to meet in here is separate. It has to come from corporate. And historically, the IMAX has not worked with churches at all. And so one of the reasons why we were praying for a location in 2020 is that we were outgrowing Theater 8, and we knew it was a no from the IMAX. It was just a no across the country. But then when we were regathering and just talking about logistically, how do we, back when we were regathering and social distancing was a really important consideration. If we were to social distance in Theater 8, we would only be able to fit about 40 people in there. Mm-hmm. And so we were really stuck trying to figure out, does it make sense to have a service with 40 people? And during that time is miraculously when the first door to the IMAX was opened so that we could come into here and social distance and have enough room for it to make sense. And so that was a huge provision at that point in time. But then about a year ago, when things were sort of returning to normal and the IMAX started showing more movies, that is when they kicked us back out. And so we were sent back to Theater 8. And so we made it work, but those of you that were around in December know we were at capacity. There were Sundays where there were not enough seats. We were starting to add overflow room, and so we really needed more space. And we had been told the IMAX was shut off to churches, but again, the door opened. We do not know why, except for the power of God. Mm-hmm. And so it really is amazing how we've yearned for a building. We've yearned to not be portable anymore. But at the same time, we have always had all we need. We have never been in want. It's like we feel a little bit like we're hopping from lily pad to lily pad, where God has just kind of said, I'm going to give you the next lily pad. I'm not going to tell you where the next one is, but this one will be enough. And so all that to say, that is why we feel a little bit like we are in a holding pattern where we feel like this is the next step, but everything that we have tried has not worked. And we know that being portable, being in the movie theater has its benefits, but it's also hard. And so we really wanted to be intentional about waiting well in this season. And when we look at the stories of those four men, and 3 out of 4 of those were in the first 2 books of the Bible. And that shows you how prominent this theme is throughout Scripture. We just came out of Advent, which is a whole season about waiting. This is a major theme in the Bible. But when we look at these 4 stories and we see that 2 waited well and 2 did not, we think that this also is instructive for us in terms of 2 temptations in seasons of waiting, not just for church, but for you and your individual lives, as well as 2 opportunities. And so we want to begin by naming what those 2 temptations are. The first we saw, especially in Abraham's story, and that is the temptation of impatience. It is so tempting to rush the process, to take shortcuts, especially when you see an open door to do so. Mm-hmm. And it's been really helpful for us to name that as pastors and as a staff.
Yeah, with the story of Abraham and him being told that he'll be the father of, many nations and all of those things, it became clear that for Abraham at some point in that process, he was like, maybe I need to help God out a little bit. Maybe this hasn't happened because I'm supposed to do something that I haven't done yet. And I think when you are, launching a church and feeling the constant pressure to take the next step, to do the next thing, to show like you're growing and you're doing well, there can be moments where you feel this sense of, maybe I need to help God out. Maybe there's something I'm not doing that I need to do. And a lot of times that impatience is driven by fears that kind of seep into your mind to really try to make something happen just so that we can say we made something happen. We took a step, we did this, and that shows, hey, we're doing well. But other fears begin to creep in of, are we are people getting tired of doing the setup and tear down? Are people not going to come because we're still in a movie theater? Are people going to make assumptions about what kind of church we are because we meet in a movie theater? One of my favorite stories around this is a couple that has been a part of our church pretty much since the beginning, but early in our time, they came and visited one Sunday, and they told us later that when they were on their way in, their assumption was that they were going to be listening to worship through like speakers or watching worship on YouTube on the screen. And they come in and they're like, oh, you guys actually have a band. And so just kind of like the assumptions that people make about a church that's meeting in a movie theater and the fears and the ways that can drive you to try to make things happen and to be impatient. And really what happens is you end up making decisions out of obedience to your fears more than out of obedience to the will of God. And so that impatience is driven by your fears more so than taking the steps when God opens the door for them to happen.
So we found that it has been really important to name that out loud as pastors and as a staff, but also just to name it for you. If you are in a season of waiting, and to be aware of the temptations of impatience to engineer outcomes, and what a cautionary tale Abraham's is, that when we try to engineer outcomes, it does not work out the way that we think that it will. So that's the first temptation. And then the second we see more in the story of Israel, and that is a scarcity mindset of fearing that you won't have enough, of hoarding resources. But primarily what we see in their story, and one that has been really convicting to us, is that when you have a scarcity mindset, you are unable to enjoy God's actual provision for you in the present.
Yeah.
And that has been really important for us to remember.
Yeah, we do something called Pray First. One Saturday a month, we gather here at the AMC and pray and walk around South Point. And we were doing this in October, I believe, of last year. And one of the things that we do as a part of that time of prayer is a sort of a session on repentance. And yes, repenting from sins, but also it's just repenting from ways that we've gotten out of step with God. As a church, are there things that we have prioritized that were not God's priorities? Is there things that we have focused on that God would not have us to focus on? Or are there things that we should be focused on but we haven't been? And as we're in this moment of prayer and repentance, we're walking around the theater and the mall here, I just had this moment where I realized, we have been thinking of the AMC as this burden, as this thing that's been holding us back, as this obstacle to all the things that we want to do as a church. And in this moment, I thought back to when we first launched and how desperately we wanted to get into the AMC, and how when that finally worked out, how much of a divine provision that felt like, and how that just was kind of like the icing on the cake of God being with this and for this work of planting a church. And so in this moment, just began to ask, how did we come to view this blessing as such a burden? This thing that was such a provision of God is now almost like this curse on us. And I thought about the story of Moses, in the wilderness. And there's places where you can dip into this story, and when the way they talk about manna, you're like, is manna poison? Was it a curse? Because they're so tired of it. They're so fed up with it. And you forget, man, this was God's miraculous provision for them, of sustenance for them. And they had gotten so tired of it. And so they cry out to God, and they're like, God, would you give us some meat? And you expect God, in some ways God's like, guys, I've already given you manna. But he indulges them, and he gives them quail, and he provides for them. And I thought about our story and how we've come to see the AMC in some ways as this burden. And yet we cry out to God to give us space, and he answers our prayer. He provides us with the IMAX as a way of saying, I'm still with you, I'm still for you, I'm still making a way where there doesn't seem like there is a way.
Yeah, I remember being at that prayer meeting with Ike and him sharing that, and I was so convicted by it, because I never want to forget that this space that you are sitting in right now is a sign of God's extravagant generosity towards Bright City Church. Amen?
Yeah.
This is a sign of his faithfulness to us. And, it's funny, I was even thinking this as you were walking through the last several years. There are two different ways that we could tell this story. We could tell this story as a story of drudgery, of being called here and then being stuck here. Or we could tell this story as a story of God's unfailing, relentless provision for our church. And how we tell that story is how we are going to feel. Mm-hmm. And so I never want to forget that this space is a sign of God's faithfulness to our church. Mm-hmm. So those are the two temptations of waiting that have been really important for us to name, to repent of. But there are also many opportunities of waiting. And because there are many, even in the story we can see there are many, we wanted to just focus on two that have been very personal for me and Ike in the last year or so. The first is actually a phrase that Ike has used a lot with our staff this past year, and that is better before bigger. That's the first opportunity of waiting, is better before bigger. And he's going to explain where this came from in a moment. But when we look at these men, one thing that you may or may not have noticed is that all four of these men shepherded sheep before they shepherded people. For all four of them, God was calling them into these shepherd years where they were learning how to lead. But I also suspect to some extent that he had these men staring at sheep day in and day out. God was also teaching, you are the sheep. I don't care where you ascend in leadership, to remember, just as this sheep is dependent on you, you must always be dependent on me. It's really easy to despise our humble beginnings instead of receive them as opportunities to grow our capacity or to grow our integrity, to purify our motives. And so that has also been an important filter for us in this season, is not yearning after bigger, but instead receiving the opportunity of better.
Yeah, over the last year, we have numerically just seen incredible growth. We went from averaging around 125 at the beginning of the year to 175 to 200 people here on Sunday morning. We now have 40 or more kids in Kid City every weekend, which is just incredible, and Sydney's done a great job with that. We launched a a young adult ministry. Shelby Cox took that over, and we've seen 30 to 40 young adults turn out for this. And so it's just been incredible to see the ways that God has blessed us numerically in 2022. But what can come along with that is this impulse to do more, of we just need to do more, and we need to add this program, and add this ministry, and add this event, and add this gathering, and add this aspect to our website, and add this element of production, and on and on and on. You can just feel this pressure to continually do more and more. And really what you end up doing in that process is burning out your team, burning out our servant leaders, and ending up just everyone is exhausted and not doing anything well because we're trying to do too much.
And also just spiritually shallow.
Yeah. And so as we were kind of feeling that pressure a little bit, I was reminded of this story that I heard on a podcast. It was one of the executives from Chick-fil-A in the 90s. He was talking about how their main competitor was Boston Market. And Boston Market had come on the scene, and they had these massive buffets, and you could get anything you wanted. And so Chick-fil-A was in this meeting, and they were like, we've got to figure out, how do we compete with Boston Market? What do we need to add to our menu? Where do we need to add more restaurants? And all this kind of this pressure of more and more and more. And in the middle of that, somebody said, I think we need to focus on doing what we do better before we think about getting bigger. And you look back and, Chick-fil-A has exploded and Boston Market is like nowhere. And as I thought about that mentality of doing better before bigger and thinking through, let's, as a church, focus on doing a few essential things really well and taking care of our team rather than caving to the constant pressure and demand to do more. And so we have really taken that idea of doing better before bigger to say, we don't want to just grow numerically this body of people who kind of look like Jesus. We want a community of people who have been discipled well into following the way of Jesus. And I was listening to one pastor talk about kind of their journey of looking for a space, and they were in a movie theater, and they were waiting for a space to work out, and I won't tell you how long they waited because you'll get discouraged, but he said during that time, their prayer was, God, do not send us more people than we can disciple well. And I remember thinking in that moment, who prays that prayer of God, don't send us more people? But I think his heart and his mind was in the right place of, God, our priority is producing disciples, followers of Jesus who are intently following the way of Jesus. And don't send us more people than we can do that well. And so just kind of that mentality of let's make sure we can do the essential things well before we worry about doing things bigger and better and more.
Yeah. And so along those lines, if you're wondering, okay, well, what does that look like practically? One of the things that we're going to be doing new this year is incorporating a curriculum called Practicing the Way. Have any of y'all heard of John Mark Comer? He's a really wonderful author, pastor of a church out in Portland, and he developed this curriculum around spiritual disciplines for churches. And we really wanted to figure out a way to come alongside of you practically and teach you how to cultivate your faith. You know, as we've talked about, as we've incorporated more liturgy into our services, that what forms us is not our beliefs, but our habits. What forms us is what we do over and over again every single day. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing twice a year with our small groups is focusing on one spiritual discipline. And we'll be doing our first one on Sabbath in February. And so we'll have a 4-week sermon series on Sabbath, and also all small groups in the church will be doing this 4-week study on Sabbath so that we can learn about and practice the spiritual discipline of Sabbath. And so that's one way going forward that we really want to equip you, not just shout at you to become more like Jesus, but really give you the tools to cultivate your faith. So that's coming in 2023. And if you're not in a small group, this is the time to join because of that. So better before bigger is one opportunity of waiting. And then the other opportunity of waiting is really the opportunity of waiting. Whether we're talking about Bright City Church, whether we're talking about a season of waiting in your own life, the opportunity of waiting is remembering your true destination. Because the arc of the Christian life is not to an achievement. The arc of the Christian life is not, getting married or raising a family or, retiring and then being able to look back and say, I ran the race well. That is something we should aspire to, but the actual destination of the Christian life is Christ. That is our destination. That's why our mission statement is helping people take their next step towards Christ. And the good news of that, when we look at these 4 stories, is that this sort of progress is not inhibited by seasons of waiting. In fact, seasons of waiting can accelerate it. Our seasons of waiting, whatever season of waiting you are in, can actually accelerate your progress towards that destination of Jesus Christ. And so what we are working toward this year, Bright City Church, is not a location. It is your spiritual formation. Our deep heart cry in this season is that on the other side of this, we will be a church that looks more like Jesus.
Yeah, the beautiful thing about this is that the goal never changes, which is Jesus' commission to go and make disciples of all nations. And so our vision, our mission to help you take your next step towards Christ is something that we can do whether we are in a building or in a theater or out on the farm, to go and make disciples, to help people take their next step towards Christ. But a part of that commission is also what Jesus says, to go and make disciples of all nations. Nations there, the Greek is ethnos, ethnicities. Our heart and our vision is still to be the multi-ethnic family of God, to pursue that vision of being a church family that reflects God's kingdom more fully. And again, we can do that whether we're in a building or on the farm or in a movie theater. And so where we want to land this morning is to say that what we want more than anything is to be closer to Jesus. As a church, to be more closely to Jesus, to follow him, to make sure the steps that we're taking as a church are in line with the steps that he would have us to take. But that's also our heart for you, is for you to be closer to Jesus this year, that you would be closer to Jesus because of you being a part of Bright City. And so where I want to end this morning is just taking some time for you to have some space to say, okay, what is my next step towards Christ? Maybe you've been a follower of Jesus your whole life. The beauty is you can take another step closer to Christ. That is a lifelong journey or process. Or maybe you decided this year, you know what, I'm going to get back into church. I'm going to take a step back towards Jesus. And so you're getting back into this. And so my question for you is, what is that next step towards Christ for you this morning? So I want to invite you to close your eyes. We're going to pray for a moment, create some space for you to just reflect, to answer that question for yourself of what is the next step for me in this season, whether I'm waiting, whether I'm in a season of moving forward, whatever that means. What is my next step towards Christ? God, in our process of waiting, there can be such a strong impulse to ask, God, why do you have me waiting? Why aren't you moving things forward? Why aren't you making things happen? And maybe what God is doing in that moment is trying to get you to pay attention to something you weren't paying attention to before. And the waiting means you have to look in some other directions. You have to consider some things you wouldn't have considered. Maybe this morning you're wondering why your relationship with Jesus hasn't moved forward and God's just been silent. But what you need to know is that God was never absent. He just wanted you to wrestle with him, to yearn for him. Because the truth is, we can never be closer to God than when we're wrestling with him. God, would you help us to see what our next step towards you is this morning? What's the step that we need to take this year? This month, this week, this morning? God, would you speak to us this morning? We are listening. Tell us, Lord, what's the next step? We are surrendering ourselves before you. We're laying it all down. We're saying, God, just tell me. I'll take that step. So God, would you speak to us?